Welcome to this special edition of Capitol Dateline. We're on the floor of the Florida House of Representatives with Speaker Will Weatherford, a Republican from Wesley Chapel, and President of the Florida Senate, Don Gaetz from Niceville. And what a great opportunity to sit here and have our customers really have a chance to see what you're thinking about the 2013 Florida legislative session. And you two have done something that I don't know that any other presiding officers have done and have had the courage to do. You've said, we're going to get together, we're going to talk about something, Work Plan Florida, and say up front 5 priority areas of public policy that we're going to work on together through this session. And Mr. Speaker, since we're in your house, we're going to start with you first and ask you this. How did you and the President come to the decision that you would put together this work plan, if you will, and then talk it through and come to these 5 areas?
Sure. Well, first of all, you can't have a work plan if you don't trust the person you're working with. And the Senate President and I, over the last 2 years, had a chance to redraw every map in the state with the redistricting process. And when we started out, we said we were going to do it a certain way. We said we were going to be transparent. We said we were going to take the politics out of it, and nobody believed us. And we stuck to our guns. And a lot of people were disappointed within our party and other parties. Outside groups who said we wouldn't stick to our word ended up seeing that we did. And what I learned from that process, and this was not an easy process, I don't want to minimize it, but what I learned was that with the Senate President, if he tells me he's going to do something, he's going to do it. And I think he learned the same thing from me. And so based on that trust and our ability to kind of get in the ditches together and fight through something, we learned that we could stick together. And so when we looked around the state of Florida and we said, what are some of the problems that exist that are out there? We wanted to pick issues that if we didn't address them, they would never get addressed. We're going to balance a budget because we have to. We're going to deal with the Affordable Care Act because we have to. But there are some issues that are out there, things like ethics reform that the Senate President's been leading on, campaign finance reform, elections reform, higher education reform, pension reform. These are things that we believe that if we don't prioritize, both of us, not just one of us, but both of us, they'll never happen. And a lot of times that's what happens up here in Tallahassee. And I'm sure you could fill this room up of people who would tell us it's a bad idea to tell people ahead of time what we want to do. But I think the trust that exists between the two of us is willing to take that on.
Mr. President, the Speaker kind of said why you selected certain areas, but you know, there are 1,000 bills, maybe more, that are filed every year. And out of all the things you could focus on, you came up with 5 areas. And how did it come down to 5 areas?
Well, first, Steve, I'm very glad that you allowed us to sit down for this interview because he's taller than me. And I have to compete against a guy who's smarter and younger and better looking and taller. So thanks for this.
Do you have your wallet covered over there?
I do.
Okay.
Well, you know, there are about 3,000 bills actually that are introduced in a typical session, and a lot of them are gently, I guess I would say, ideas whose time has not come and may never come. Some are very important. But, you know, we learned as we went around the state through redistricting, and I think everybody who runs for public office and knocks on doors and has town meetings learns that the level of trust in public officials in this country has dropped considerably. Mm-hmm. You know, the Congress has a 9% approval rating. We're doing a lot better than that, but Muammar Gaddafi had a 14% approval rating, and his people killed him. So it seems to me that the very first thing we needed to do in order to be able to do anything else was to show that these representatives and these senators are in public office not for private gain, but because we have an obligation for public service. So that was a seminal building block in our decision to move forward and do so in a joint agenda. First, establish public trust, then work on issues that really were brought to us as a result of a series of flawed elections in Florida. The Speaker said, you know, we just can't have Florida be a state that turns in its presidential ballot results 5 days after the election is known. We have to be timely, we have to be accurate, we have to be fair. And once again, we had some counties that I guess have been chronically problematic, have problems again, and we need to find out why, and that's part of restoring public trust. Run fair, transparent elections that people can really count on. And then we can move on to other issues that really matter around the kitchen table, like education and making sure that pensions that people are counting on for their future are really going to be there. And those are the kitchen table issues that we hear about as we move around the state and as we knock on doors in our own districts.
Let's talk about ethics for a moment, and then we're going to get to election reform. As I know that there's legislation on a very fast track on ethics reform, and in the Senate particularly. What are the specific issues that you're most concerned about in ethics reform? What are the things that bother you and bother your constituents about what's been happening in public life with officials that destroy the public trust?
Well, just this year, Steve, the state of Florida had to write off $800,000 in fines and penalties that were levied against politicians and public officials. Those fines were for violation of elections laws and ethics laws, and they wrote off the fines because they were uncollectible. So I think that bothers a lot of people. I think public officials, and the Speaker and I agree, public officials ought to set the standard, not drag behind the standard of proper behavior. You know, if the average man or woman on the street owes money, they got to pay it. They don't get to have it written off. If they haven't paid their taxes, they get a lien on their property. So first, we're saying that if a public official is found guilty, owes a fine, has violated elections or ethics laws, they ought to pay their fine or have their public salary garnished or maybe have their property liened against. We think that's important. Secondly, we think that people in Florida ought to be able to find out what Will and I owe, who we owe, and what we own, and the same with other public officials. They ought to be able to find it easily, so we want to put financial disclosures online. We think that people ought not to get 2 public paychecks if they don't deserve it. It's fine for firefighters, police officers, teachers, others who have a history in a particular area and credentials to then run for office. We want to encourage that. But when somebody gets elected to the legislature and they've got no background in education at all, and then suddenly they're a member of the Education Committee, the Appropriations Committee, they can vote on billions of dollars in education funding, and suddenly they become an expert on education and they get hired by some school district or college for a $50 or $80 or $100,000 a year walking around job. We think that's wrong.
Mr. Speaker, kind of in the same vein, in the work plan Florida, you have really wanted to get some major reforms done in Florida's election law relating to transparency with regard to funds that people contribute to, and maybe you don't know where the money's coming from, you don't know how much somebody's contributed. Talk about that some and kind of what you'd like to see done.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to commend the Senate President on the ethics reform initiatives he's taken. I mean, literally, you know, there was a grand jury report not too long ago that talked about some of these flaws, and they've been ignored for several years. And so, excuse me, but the fact that he has taken this on and that we have joined him in this fight, I think is very admirable. But I also believe that in order to do true ethics reform, you've got to have a campaign finance reform component to it. And although they may or may not be the same bill, that we have to be cognizant of the fact that there's tens of millions of dollars being spent in campaigns, but most of that money is not being spent in campaigns. And all these, we've empowered all these third-party groups, and there are specific entities that are out there called CCEs that I won't bore your viewers with the actual name, but long story short, they're this slush fund that exists that really has no real purpose as far as electing somebody to office, but people are raising a lot of money in them.
What's being done with some of that money that not directly related to campaign
Well, that's
activity?
the challenge in knowing, but a lot of people believe that some folks are subsidizing their lifestyle with it. What I can
living out of it, in other words.
It could be, you know, and I'm not here to pass judgment on what other people do, but what I am here to do is say we live in a world where unlimited giving is legal and is happening. And it's unlimited everywhere except for in the campaign. And we're not actually advocating for unlimited giving in campaigns, but we're just saying we need to have an adult conversation about the insane campaign finance laws we have in Florida. And I think if we can address that and couple it with these wonderful ethics reforms that we're talking about here today, we can make a significant difference in the culture of this body. And that's why what Senate President said is, you know, if the people don't trust their government because their elections laws are bad, or their campaign finance laws are bad, or they don't believe that their leaders are ethical, it's hard for us to convince them that what we're doing for our kids in our schools is going to be right. And so this is kind of step one in trying to solve that problem.
To restore trust
Yes.
in the decision-making process. Let's move to a little bit different subject. We've only got a couple of minutes or so left in this segment, and it's an important subject. For years, education reform has centered on K through 12. Now, both of you want to center some attention on higher education. And Mr. Speaker, let's go to you again. You're very interested in online education and what it might mean. We've got so many students that we want to educate, and online education, in your view, may be a way we can do it without bricks and mortar.
Well, I don't think we'll ever completely replace bricks and mortar universities, but I believe that the way people are learning and the way they access information is dramatically changing. And there is what I call a tsunami coming to the education system as we know it in higher education. And technology is allowing us to leverage the high quality education that we have and making it accessible to everybody. And I just believe that while every university currently has an online degree program, most of them have those programs, but they're there to make money and offer online degrees. But the truth is, if you were to ask them, most of them could produce a lot of those degrees for a whole lot less money than what they're charging. And the state of Florida has decided it's going to substitute a traditional student to the tune of $40,000 or $50,000, but we don't subsidize a student who wants to take the same class online. And I just think we should learn how to make our education system more accessible and more affordable, and also give it to people in the comfort of their own home if they so choose to do it there. And I think it's going to change the way we educate our kids, and I want Florida to be on the front end of that reform, not on the back end.
Let's go to break and come back and talk about some more of your priorities.